Did you know that the Chinook salmon of the Yukon River make the longest migration of any salmon in the world? They swim more than 3,000 kilometers from the Bering Sea all the way across Alaska and the Yukon and almost to the British Columbia border. This is like driving from Vancouver to Kansas City. To make this distance, these salmon have to swim more than a single marathon every day before they reach their spawning grounds. Founded in 1987, the Pacific Salmon Foundation was originally the recipient of a small startup grant from the Ministry of Fisheries and has grown quite a bit today. The idea of the PSF was to complement the community-based work of the Federal Fisheries Ministry, and we're tasked with the mission of expanding BC salmon's resource. Today I'm joined with PSF's President and CEO, Michael Meneer, and Vice President Jason Hwang. Prior to moving to Vancouver in 2007, Michael had a career in Washington, D.C. as a journalist and communications officer, so we expect you to speak very well on this podcast. His experience and education brought him to the Pacific Salmon Foundation, where he started off as the Vice President for Development, Communications and Marketing for 10 years, and obviously hard work pays off because 2 years ago, Michael was promoted to President and CEO. And as a local boy, Jason attended both SFU and BCIT before starting his career as a habitat biologist at the Fisheries and Oceans. And you were part of the team that made changes to the Fisheries Act in 2012. So today we've got both Michael and Jason with us as part of the expert team, and for us to talk about your number one constituent is the Pacific salmon. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Andrew. Good to be here.
Yeah, we've been working on this for probably about 6 or 7 months to get you fellas in. Obviously, COVID didn't help, and we are going to talk about 4 main themes. First of all, you guys are going to give us the sort of State of the Union address on how salmon are doing here in BC and BC's coastal waters. We're going to switch to that and talk about some of the specific and acute challenges that are going on in the salmon species today. We're going to talk about some of your solutions as this foundation, the Pacific Salmon Foundation. And finally, at the end, we're going to talk about how the community can get involved. Now, it's kind of good timing that you came in today because the federal government just announced their budget a week ago, and you have earmarked $647 million to bolster efforts to save the Pacific salmon stocks. So starting with that statement, Michael and Jason, let's hear your comments on how's the salmon stocks looking today?
Well, thanks again for having us, Andrew.
Yeah.
It's great that you do this.
Yeah.
I would start with a very positive comment. We like to have a glass half full approach, but the fact of the matter is, as you articulated in your opening there, salmon are very resilient. They've been around for eons. They've been adapting for eons, and they've come along. They're still with us, and in most cases, very strong and thriving and maintaining themselves. Right. So, what we have to try to do in BC is make sure that everything that we can control, we are turning in the direction of helping Pacific salmon. Of course, there are many stocks that are struggling, some that are in crisis. And in particular, here in the lower mainland, our Fraser watershed that we're on, we have quite a few stocks that have been analyzed by an independent panel of scientists as either being what are considered threatened or on the verge of extinction. And so we have to do everything that we can to make sure that those particular stocks, many of them interior Fraser stocks, meaning they're born in the interior Fraser, make their way down and head out to the ocean. That we're doing everything we can to maintain the ones we have and restore them. And that involves making sure the habitat is protected and restored, that we're managing water in particular. Salmon need abundant cold water in the freshwater context at both the beginning and end of their life cycles. And then, do everything that we can using artificial means like hatcheries, where there are stocks that need to be rebuilt, and to do that strategically and scientifically, protecting their genetic diversity, of course. And then where we have human beings who interact with salmon through fisheries, making sure those fisheries are conducted in a way that, again, is going to ensure that those stocks that we have that are threatened or potentially extinct don't get any worse. And ideally, we have an opportunity to make those mitigations upriver that will help them. So, we have had in the past couple of years very historic low returns of some species like sockeye salmon, Chinook and coho, and these are, of course, the stocks that are most prized for fisheries purposes. Many of those stocks are not doing well, and that's why, as you alluded to, the government has announced a major, I think it's historic in the sense that I don't know that we've ever had a one-time investment, maybe back in the 70s.
Yeah, I don't think anything to this scale.
But it's a major one-time investment and a recognition that we've got to put everything that we can into restoring these stocks. And I should say the provincial government has also kicked in a significant amount of money and interest relative to what they had been doing historically. So, again, glass half full, these are resilient animals. And the other thing I would say, the reason why we take a positive point of view on salmon, Andrew, is we have a tremendous, both in terms of size and passion, community of people that care very much about salmon. Not only care, but they go out, they roll up their sleeves, they put on their gumboots and their waders, they get in the water, and they do everything they can to make sure their stream, their river, their estuary is looked after for salmon. We've counted over 35,000 volunteers that have been supported through our programs or our grant-making programs. So I think when you have that resilience of the animal, and then you have a strong, devoted constituency devoted to wild salmon, I think we can fix this problem.
Okay.
Now you got more resources coming at it, financial resources. So I'm optimistic, cautiously optimistic about the future.
Well, that's a good positive angle, Michael, and one that I was quite surprised to hear you say. And the reason I say that is because when I look at the stats, they're not very good. And I agree with your comment as being an angler myself, and done lots of little fishing, sports fishing trips. Everybody I meet, whether it's a First Nations group that I've met a few times, or myself, or my friends that go, we all want to see strong stocks of salmon. I mean, I don't think anybody wants to see these populations diminishing.
That's a very good point. And I think part of where we've gotten, because things have gotten as poor as they have for some of our stocks, is that you have constituencies, groups of human beings, recreational anglers, commercial anglers, First Nations, who may have had very adversarial historical issues or baggage. These things are getting worked through because everyone recognizes that we're in a very serious situation for many of these things. We've all got to work together to make sure we have these fish for the future.
Yeah, to comment a bit further on that, I think some of the things that people see out on the water can be confusing because like what we heard last year as an example is some people were having great fishing days. There were lots of fish out there. They could fish for a couple of hours and bring maybe a dozen fish to the boat or more in some cases. And so when they look at that and they say, I'm hearing there's a conservation problem, but at the same time, when I go fishing, I'm catching lots of fish and I'm being told I have to put them all back. I can't keep them. And it leads to some frustration. And that's some of the understanding that we're trying to help share with people is, while some stocks are doing quite well, other stocks that co-migrate at the same time are in some of the worst condition we've ever seen them. And some of them are to the point where they're being considered for endangered species listing, and there's serious concern for their long-term conservation. So it's a tricky balancing act where there are some healthy populations and it would be reasonable to fish for those, but it's also very difficult to make sure at the same time you're conserving the weak stocks that are also migrating in the mix. And a lot of people are searching for solutions in terms of how can we maintain ongoing access to fishing while we also want to support these weak stocks and help them kind of come out of the hole and recover.
I think that's a really good point, Jason, because I've got this slide here. We'll bring it up for the folks to see at home. And you've used this slide, this one here, which basically details the various streams. So if I look at here, for example, there's the Middle Fraser River Canyon. I'm calling them streams to simplify this.
Yeah, they're conservation units. So they're close to often watershed units, but they're conservation units of salmon that are genetically distinct from the other conservation units.
So is it fair to say that maybe part of the issue is that a simple person like myself only knows that at best there's 5 species of salmon, not recognizing that even within those 5 species, there's certain sort of sub-segment groups that spawn certain waters, and they're not going to go elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And is that part of the issue we're dealing with here?
Yeah, that is really the crux of the issue. Is these populations that have evolved in a large river system like the Fraser are all ideally suited to the watershed that they come from. They're adapted to the water temperature, the size of stream, the size of rocks they have to move to lay their eggs, to sharing that habitat with the other species that they have to compete with. And so they're all ideally adapted, since the last ice age, to the conditions that they've evolved in. And so they're genetically distinct. You could not pull a Chinook from one of these rivers and drop it into another one and expect it to be as successful as the one that is from there. I'm not saying that you can't help them out, or in some cases where you've got a major conservation problem. There have been transplants that have been successful, but there's nothing as good as what has genetically evolved to be ideally suited for that stream.
Yeah.
And so when you look at a chart like the one that you have up here, the idea is that there are some Chinook, this is a chart of Chinook populations in southern BC, primarily the Fraser River. And the idea on this chart is showing that there are some populations that are not at risk. They're the green ones, and there's only 3. All the others are some degree of either concern, or there's a few that we don't have enough data to actually determine right now. But ideally, what you would be looking at here is a chart that's mostly green, and maybe you would have, 1 or 2 that have a bit of concern to them. Instead, we're looking at a chart that doesn't have a lot of green. And this becomes part of the problem, because in this situation, one of the populations that's doing really well is the South Thompson population, which it's right where I live. I live in Kamloops. So these fish come right by, and they're doing really well. And a lot of people
But there's a South Thompson right below it that's endangered, it says.
Well, that's right. And those are also Chinook. And this is part of the story around what's amazing and wonderful, but also challenging with these salmon. So the South Thompson Chinook, the ones that are healthy, spawn in the large South Thompson River. That's a big river. It's got Shuswap Lake, kind of in the middle as a great water supply. It's a buffer. You've always got enough water. The water's always clean. You don't have temperature problems in the South Thompson River. And then the other populations that are spawning in the exact same general area are different types of Chinook, where they go into smaller streams and they live in those streams for a whole year. And those smaller streams are having trouble. They're suffering from droughts. They are more susceptible to the effects of development pressure. And those fish have to live in those streams after they hatch for a whole year. That's their life history.
Wow.
And in that year, if you have one bad day or one bad week, that whole population of fish that's gotten in there and gotten to that point can all be killed or die off, or at least severely reduced in just one bad event.
Wow.
And so, the South Thompson population is an example of a place that is probably naturally resilient. Those fish are in a bigger river. And the other interesting thing with those fish is they don't stay in their home stream for a year. They actually go to the ocean after somewhere around 60 to 90 days. So they have less exposure to the kinds of bad things that can happen in the freshwater environment. And yet, right beside them, there's this other population that, over the course of time since the last glaciers were here, have evolved to also be successful. But now, under the pressures of human development, climate change, and other things, you're starting to see these major conservation problems show.
Right. Well, this list here, Jason, has roughly about 37 different species that you're talking about. Or what did you call them again?
They're conservation units.
Conservation units.
So those are all Chinook salmon.
Just Chinook.
That's just Chinook on that list.
36 of them. 3 are not at risk. That's less than 10%. So if we were to look back at this table, say 20 years ago, how many of these would you, if you had to estimate, what would this graph look like compared to how green would it be?
20 years ago, I'm kind of shooting from the hip here, but based on my time, and I've worked in the Fraser area for a long time, you might have had 1 or 2 of these that you had a significant flag on. It would have been
almost all green.
Yeah. In the last 20 years, we've seen a significant change in the well-being of these populations.
Yeah, I think just kind of step back to a bigger picture perspective. This is a very complex challenge, and it's complex for a number of reasons. One, it's the scale of geography. We have 27,000 kilometers of coastline that has to be managed for Pacific salmon purposes on the west coast of Canada. There are upwards of 1,500 different streams, rivers that have salmon in them in the BC and the Yukon. You mentioned the Yukon as well, which is a major salmon stream. So the scale of the thing is huge, and this is why when we say we have limited data, it's a big area to cover.
Sure.
There's 7 different species, right?
7. I said 5, so there's 7.
That's all right.
Yeah. What are
okay.
they? Let me test you.
Go ahead. I can do the easy
7
one.
species?
Well, there's in Canada, people would generally say there's 5 species of Pacific salmon.
Okay.
So you've got your pink, chum, sockeye, chinook, and coho. And then a lot of people will also include steelhead because they are a salmonid. It goes to the ocean. It has a very similar life history, but some things are different, and it's definitely a different, it's a species on its own. And then you also have sea run cutthroat that people will often include in there if we're counting up to 7. And then there's other kind of cousins in the family as well, but most people would say that the true Pacific salmon, there are 5, and then steelhead is a commonly referred to 6th, and then the sea run cutthroat, and then other cousins start to fit in if you start to count higher than that.
Yeah.
So it is a complex, clear as mud, right?
Yeah.
It's a complex problem, and we do lack sufficient data, particularly in the freshwater streams and systems. Huge number of our Chinook stocks, for example, they're data incomplete. We have a whole program devoted to trying to improve the data on returns of salmon. What's the habitat like where they're spawning? And I think the point that I would kind of make to the information that Jason has been sharing is that salmon, their life, they're unique in that they're born in freshwater. They migrate out to the open ocean, saltwater, and they have to come back to that very stream where they started their life and spawn and then die, and the whole cycle then begins anew. We don't really have a very cohesive plan or approach for how we manage that freshwater habitat in a coordinated way. We have lots of interests, lots of groups that want to do the right thing, but they're not coordinated. And that's one of the messages that we keep taking to the government, both federal and provincial and First Nations. We think our friends down in Washington State have a bit of a lead on this. They have a model down there that they started 20 years ago where they actually have divided the state into 8 different sub-regions, and they have what they call salmon recovery boards at those regional levels that look at these complex challenges within the systems in those regions. They're the ones closest to it. And they're consisting of elected officials, First Nations leaders, conservation organizations. And I think we have a couple of regions in BC where this model, I call it bottom up as opposed to top down, where this has been used effectively. The Okanagan is one area. And so we need to be doing more of that because as Jason's data shows, these are really specific, complex, localized challenges at the beginning, origin point for salmon, and the place where they end their lives as well. And so we're pushing for the government, as it thinks about this new money, is not just to do the same old approach,
Right.
but to start doing things differently and to try to come from the bottom up, more grassroots-oriented coordination on these streams and rivers, for salmon.
Okay. Well, that makes sense.
Well, and just to build on that, Andrew, I think that's a good picture of the freshwater, and that we don't have a good picture, but that follows through to the ocean as well. And I think the comment that you were referring to that Dr. Riddle was speaking to is around the lack of information we have on what is happening to these salmon in the time they spend out in the open ocean mixed
Which is
with
most
salmon.
of their life, right?
It depends on the species, but, but for a lot of them, it's a majority of their life is out in the open ocean. There are salmon from other countries out there all across the North Pacific. And we have very, very little information to understand what is happening. And I think there's no question that changes in the ocean ecosystem are what's driving, the major thing driving some of the declines that we're seeing right now.
Yeah.
And then that is compounded or further complicated by things that are happening in the freshwater, as Mike described. So we really lack, the information that you would want to have to manage this well. And if you don't have information and good science to understand what's happening, you're really starting to guess when you want to take interventions to make things better. And it's a very, very important issue to a lot of people, the well-being of salmon. And so I think it's why we're really strongly advocating having the science to inform the decisions. It's not just science for the sake of science. Yeah. It's science so we know what's going on.
Better policies.
And so we can take better actions and have better policies.
Right. Sure, that makes sense. Michael, you mentioned about the lack of coordination. Is one of the issues the fact that fisheries is a federal jurisdiction, but it ends when it turns in from ocean water to fresh water? It now becomes a provincial jurisdiction. Is that one of the issues?
You hit that is a complication for sure.
Yeah,
that is a man-made one by our politicians.
Sure, yeah.
That's one we could fix, right?
Yeah, it is.
And I think that you've hit it right on the head. And by the way, this is not to in any way suggest that the people that work for Fisheries and Oceans or the province are deficient. They're wonderful people. They're very intelligent people. Jason worked for them for many years before we stole him. Our science advisor, Dr. Brian Riddle, as well. We have a very good relationship with Fisheries and Oceans and the province. But it makes it complicated.
It would be like blaming nurses for a poorly run healthcare system. It's not their fault. I mean, it's the design of the over many years.
There are probably a lot of corollaries to this, the COVID situation we're dealing with, and where you have communications breakdowns, the vaccination challenges we're having in Canada right now, where you have different authorities, wanting to do things differently. It is a nature of, I think, living in a democratic society.
Right.
But it's one we do have to fix. And I think it's one that is going to be advanced significantly in terms of improvement, because we have a context in Canada where First Nations are being empowered much more significantly through the adoption of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. This is going to drive a much more local need for a much more localized collaborative approach, because First Nations approach to managing anything is very, very localized. There will be...
Which is what you're talking about, Jason, which is where the problem lies. So I guess if you have a localized solutions to a localized problem, you're going to have some success.
You can't say we've looked after the ocean, so don't worry about what's happening locally, or you can't say I've got a great plan for the region and that'll solve everything. You really need to work at all the scales, and they need to fit together under an effective plan, as Mike has been framing, in order to get the results we want.
Yeah.
So it's not just about picking one thing.
Yeah.
That's right. And I would add to what Jason's saying there, a lot of credit is due to both the federal and provincial government. There have been significant steps taken in the last couple of years in particular to work more closely together. I give you one example is on the topic of this conversion from open net pen aquaculture of salmon to closed containment. The federal government announced a consultation to help facilitate that transition led by one of our local MPs, Terry Beach. He invited the lead provincial MLA for salmon, Finn Donnelly, to join him as part of that consultation. So they were at the discussions and hearings together. This type of coordination at a political level is the right direction and the right step forward. So we just have to, Andrew, like so much that's related to the environment and climate change, we have to bring a sense of urgency to it. We really have to get on with it, because a lot of the scientists globally and even here in Canada are saying, the data is pointing towards action needed in the next decade.
Sure.
Certainly, if we're going to make any positive changes, for the environment. So,
yeah.
I'll add a comment on this, and that is, it's really important for people that care about this for whatever reason to understand that societally our mindset is important. And I think the way salmon have been managed to date has been, we'll do all this other stuff, and if something breaks in the world of salmon, well, we'll fix it. We'll do habitat restoration, or we'll start up a hatchery and that'll solve the problem, or we'll do something, that we'll get the biologists to work their science magic. And it isn't like that. Like if you think about it, the way I think about it, we live in a tremendously privileged and resourceful society here in Canada, in North America. And I think that we can have development, we can have a prosperous economy, but we have to be mindful of the fact that the ability of nature to absorb impacts is not endless.
Yeah,
And
sure.
you can do things and have a development activity, have a prosperous economy, but you need to make sure when that's being undertaken that a similar amount of attention and appropriate investment is made in sustaining the natural resource that was there before any of us showed up. And it's the idea that we can just do whatever we want and still have salmon be okay that is the fallacy. And as biologists, I think we've contributed to that a little bit by saying, well, we can restore and, hatcheries can do some things. Those are true. And we can do stuff to make it better, but we have to stop wrecking stuff on the way.
Right.
Because we're digging the hole deeper as we try to fix things.
Sure.
And this is not an anti-development or anti-economy message. Like, I drive a car,
Yeah.
I turn my lights on, and I hope that I can keep doing that. But it's about thinking about these things and starting to make choices that start to tip the balance towards sustainability for salmon, as opposed to working against it and thinking we can fix it after.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's a really good point.
And we have this context historically in Canada, don't we, where we have on the East Coast the history of the cod collapse that looms large in fisheries kind of history.
Yeah.
We often joke because we will get a federal fisheries minister who is from West Coast Canada. And it's so much easier because they live here, they see all the boats, they know the communities, And then more often than not, God love them, we get East Coast ministers, and they have a different frame of reference often for salmon issues because, there's really not much, there's no really recreational fishery, I don't believe, left for salmon.
It's
Very little.
very limited,
Very
limited, and it's costly. And you basically there's no public just walk up and go fishing. You get a permit for a piece of water for a day. And that's where you get to fish, or a couple of days. It's very, very.
And on top of that, the cod thing looms large, and it's kind of a negative kind of historical reference, I know. But the reason I raise all this is to say we do have a thriving Pacific salmon set of species here. They have the ability to be restored. They are resilient, as I said, and we have people in spades committed to doing the right thing. So we here on the West Coast are, in addition to Jason's points there, we have salmon and we have the ability, to turn this around. And that mindset, as Jason said, I think it's an excellent point. This is so key that I hope that comes out from us, that we have a very positive and optimistic mindset for what can be done.
Mm-hmm.
But, the other thing I'd say about the Salmon Foundation is we've evolved as the situation has evolved for salmon as a nonprofit organization. When I started at PSF 12 years ago, our current science advisor, Brian Rill, was our CEO, and I worked for him for many years. And we got into science in a big way. We had just been doing the community grant making, what's wonderful, and we continue to, it's our heart and soul. And then we got into science with Brian's leadership because he'd come from DFO science, and he sensed, not sensed, it was real, that budgets were being cut for science. We were undermining the scientists by not letting them speak publicly. And someone had to do the science because, as you pointed out earlier, the freshwater data, the Strait of Georgia data, all points back to the mid-'90s, early '90s. Everything just went in the can, right? Mm-hmm. But nothing was being done. And so we got into science in a big way. And now we have multiple science programs, open ocean all the way up into freshwater. A huge part of our organization. It's about 60% of what we do now. And then we got into data again because leadership was needed. There wasn't enough data to even make good decisions.
How can you're flying blind as a leader if you don't have the data or the science behind you to make policies?
And to the DFO's credit, the Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and Rebecca Reed, who's their regional director general, they invested money in us to do this because she candidly said, look, you will get it done faster, more efficiently than we can get this done. So, I'm proud of our little old nonprofit that started in 1987 because we continue, like the salmon, we evolve. And we go in those directions strategically where there's leadership needed, where action needs to be catalyzed. And I think the material that we're developing, the science that we're uncovering, is really, I think, in the next 10 years going to be very helpful in terms of how we then put action plans for restoration into play.
Okay. Well, this is good. Well, we're going to get into that, and we're actually going to talk about what the PSF does to help these salmon species. But I do want to spend a bit more time talking about some of these statistical realities of our world today, just so that people can really, for the listeners, this can really sink in.
Context.
Okay, so to let the listeners really let this sink in, 2020, this is a statistic from one of your slides. It's the all-country commercial catch summary for Pacific salmon in the North Pacific, valued in thousands of tons. And the year before, in 2019, there were just below 1 million thousand tons. What is that? That's a billion tons of salmon.
I have a history degree, by the way, Andrew, so don't look at me or anything related to numbers.
Well, I'm the finance guy.
Yeah,
I should be able to nail these numbers.
Look at you.
The next year it dropped by 40%. And just to give people a context, because this graph shows us going all the way back to 1970, just to eyeball this, the amount of salmon that were pulled out of the ocean last year, and it's not like these commercial fishermen aren't trying. And it's not like they don't have the technology. I mean, their technology is far more advanced than it was 20 years ago. The last time they had this low of a sort of harvest, if you want to call it, was in 1982. Now, what's also interesting in this statistic is Canada, which is the bottom of this in yellow, is basically a rounding error on this list. Alaska has generally been consistent every year from what I can see all the way back in the early 80s. Japan has dwindled down as far as what they're harvesting. But what's fascinating is the Russians. And I see this here as being that they're just continuing to expand how much salmon they're pulling out of the ocean. Am I reading this graph right? Have we got a Russian problem here?
Well, I wouldn't just, that is an enticing extract and maybe simplification. I wouldn't call it a Russian problem. Okay. But
he's so diplomatic when he corrects me, isn't he?
I'll speak to some of the things to explain the context for this slide and maybe some of the takeaways that you're leading to.
Please, yeah, because this is pretty compelling.
Yeah. So the context for this slide was prepared by Dr. Brian Riddle for us to update our board, because the PSF board of directors said, hey, can you give us a summary of the state of salmon right now? We hear, one person tells us salmon are doing great, another person tells us they're not doing great, and we see all these different reports. And so can you organize this and lay it out for us and tell us what's going on? So this was part of that context. And the point that Brian meant to highlight by displaying this slide was the big drop from 2019 to 2020. And it's saying that something major is going on out there in the North Pacific that's causing this drop. And when we spoke to this slide, one of the people asked us, well, maybe that was just because of COVID, right? People didn't go fishing. And Brian says through the panels that he sits on, no, that's absolutely not the case. It's what you said, Andrew. They were fishing, they were trying. This is more than likely, with fairly high certainty, a signal that something major is going on in the North Pacific and that there were fewer fish out there to be caught. So one of the things that is interesting, confusing, and we still don't understand very well is how all the salmon out there in the North Pacific interact. And one of the parts that maybe I should have introduced earlier when you were just asking for the overall picture of salmon, we were talking about some of the stocks in British Columbia that are doing really poorly. There are recent science papers out there that say there are actually more salmon, total salmon, in the North Pacific now, maybe not 2020, but up, because this report was about a year old, more salmon in the North Pacific than ever. But what seems to be happening is it's a shift in what kinds of salmon from where are out there. And in particular, what the authors of a couple of these papers have spoken to is there's a lot of hatchery production of pink and chum. So pink salmon and chum salmon coming from Alaska, Russia, and Japan. Like huge amounts of hatchery enhancement where people who might be familiar with some of the hatcheries in British Columbia will say, oh, I've seen a hatchery. They can produce a lot of salmon. The Canadian production of salmon compared to the overall salmon enhancement going into the North Pacific is around 6% if you include everything. And if you don't include our sockeye spawning channels, which a lot of people would say are not that different from nature. We've created an ideal habitat for them, but they swim in on their own, they leave on their own. We don't feed them or anything like that. If you exclude those, we're only about 3% of the total enhancement in the whole North Pacific. So there are all these conundrums out there. There are more salmon, but there are interactions that are going on where Bristol Bay in Alaska, their sockeye populations seem to still be doing great. Yet in Canada, our sockeye populations, many of them are not doing well. And in fact, even in other parts of Alaska, their sockeye populations are not doing well. So there's a huge story of complexity and interactions out there that kind of goes back to the point that Mike and I were touching on earlier around having the science and information to understand what's going on so that we can make informed decisions. But the work that we do in Canada is a small part of what's happening out in the North Pacific, as you're starting to see when you question, well, what's going on these slides? So yes, Russia's doing a lot of fishing, but what I would say you want to couple with that is they're doing a lot of enhancement too. And that enhancement might actually be leading to unintended competitive interactions out there in the North Pacific with our salmon.
Oh, interesting.
And so we have to start thinking about that and start thinking it's not just a problem that we need to look at locally in BC or Canada. We need to start thinking about it internationally.
And for the history majors in the audience, Jason describes this to me as, the open ocean out there is the grocery store. And if there's too many folk going to the grocery store, there's not going to be enough for everybody.
It's a classic tragedy of the commons, isn't it?
I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And this is compounded by the scientists pointing to data that shows that the water temperatures are warming.
Okay.
And the water temperatures warming are creating changes and uncertainty relative to food production for salmon in the marine context. So if there's not enough food and there's too many fish, then that's not a good recipe. So again, that's, I believe, something we can change.
Mm-hmm.
We can affect that. But back to the complexity point, you're now talking about an international diplomatic challenge.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
But if that's...
We'll send Jason.
He's very diplomatic, isn't he? That's why I hired him. But, I think it's something we do have to be highlighting for our elected officials federally in particular as they have conversations.
Yeah.
There is a North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission, which is made up of, it's a multilateral organization focused on salmon, made up of people from all these countries. And this research is being shared. So it's something we've got to try to get on.
And it tracks all the way back to home, right? We can observe these things, and this was my comment on the production of hatchery fish from other countries wasn't meant to point a finger at them. It's meant to say this is what some of the science is indicating to us, and we should be thinking about it. But we should be tracking that all the way back to home here. Like one of the calls that we hear from people who really care about the salmon in their community is, okay, if there aren't enough salmon, build us a hatchery and we'll volunteer and we'll make them in the hatchery. Well, I think hatcheries have done many wonderful things, but they're also not the solution every time. And when you have a situation that might be driven by other things, a hatchery in your local watershed might not be the solution. So I'm kind of walking on some slippery thin ice here, because a lot of people are really polarized around hatcheries. You either love them or you hate them. I'm in the middle, where hatcheries done the right way, in the right place, can be a huge benefit to the conservation and management of salmon resources. But they're also not a magic solution that you go, got a problem, start a hatchery.
Right.
They need to be done carefully to avoid unintended consequences and to ideally fit very seamlessly into the natural ecosystem, as opposed to a major intrusion on top of it. And when hatcheries are done well, they operate like that. And I would say most hatcheries, in my view, in British Columbia are run that way.
Who runs our hatcheries in British Columbia?
Well, starting at sort of the largest scale production, we have federally supported hatcheries in British Columbia. That's where the vast majority of production comes from. But then there are other levels. We have, what are called economic development hatcheries that are not as big as the sort of government ones we're talking about, but also not as small as some of these small third layer, which is kind of these community-based hatcheries, which are very much focused around stewardship, getting people out, engaged in supporting conservation, getting kids out, learn about salmon. So there's three, I think best to describe it, three kind of sizes of hatcheries. The Salmon Foundation supports through grants the middle layer and the small layer.
Gotcha.
The community economic development hatcheries, and then the small scale community hatcheries. And we're working with them. We have a research program right now, our hatchery effectiveness program, to try to help all these hatcheries identify the best possible technologies and practices to make sure that the fish that they do put out are going to have the best chance for survival. There's a great example I was thinking as Jason was talking there about working with the hatcheries. I was out this summer on Vancouver Island up near the Comox, Courtney area. And there's a stream up there called the Millard-Piercy stream. We have a very strong stewardship group there. And they, for many years, had a small, hatchery. And these hatcheries are many times like, 20 by 20, small operation, volunteer driven, pride of the community.
Right.
This is a group of volunteers, Andrew, that actually made the decision themselves, I think it was about a decade ago, that they were going to stop their hatchery production because they'd been doing their own citizen science data tracking it, and they just said, this isn't making a difference. Really? So we're going to stop doing that for now. And this was in consultation with Fisheries and Oceans, who supervise these things. And they decided to totally reorient themselves around understanding the habitat, changing the stream, a riparian habitat, which is the vegetation along the side of the stream, shoring up the quality of the spawning habitat, and then started a citizen science monitoring program. There were people every day out there measuring water quality, water volume, how is the stream or river changing, are there opportunities to create side channels, we call them, where the fish can hide, where they can spend the winters in some species cases. So this group has completely reoriented themselves and done an excellent job and seen some very positive returns with their salmon by getting out of the hatchery operation in that context and focusing on habitat and citizen science. Now, as Jason says, there's some places where you do need hatcheries. And what we're trying to do is work with our 340 plus grantees that we have, that the ones that do have hatcheries, to try to make sure that they're, doing them well. One of the other things we found through our science is that, where you release your little fish out of the hatchery and when, so location and timing of release, this is hugely important. You can't just turn the pipe on and let all the salmon that you just raised go out at once, because if you do, what you're going to find are a bunch of predators that are very bright that just have a buffet, and right. So you've just raised all those salmon for, the mergansers and the heron and
right.
seals. And we haven't talked about seals yet. We can get into that if you want to get into something complex.
Yeah.
But so we're doing the research, working with some of these hatcheries now to figure out, okay, well, how can you stagger the location, time? Are there some like Chinook that you can raise to larger size in an open pen type of situation, and then that gives them a higher likelihood of successfully having a higher number come to return.
Interesting.
Because I think our stat is, it's about, in terms of the wild to hatchery success, it's about half.
It depends where. But
Yeah.
I think that was some of the findings from the Cowichan as an example that we studied.
So those hatchery fish coming back do about half as well as the wild fish, right? So how can you, if you're going to do hatcheries, how can you change the way they operate to make sure that those hatchery fish do better? Okay. And yes, we have to answer the question, and it is a what's the word? A contentious one potentially, of this notion of wild versus hatchery interaction.
Can I just mention one thing?
Go ahead. Yeah.
there is one other hatchery model out there, or at least one, that we should mention if we're going to talk about the hatchery conversation. And that is what Mike described, government kind of running hatcheries and communities, small community groups running hatcheries. There's one that we are involved with, which is a really innovative, interesting partnership in Rivers Inlet. It's the Percy Walkus Hatchery, where it's
And
a
just
partnership.
for the listeners, give it context. Where is Rivers Inlet and Percy?
So Rivers Inlet is in the central coast of British Columbia, a great, well-known salmon area south of Bella Coola.
Okay,
I'll say,
perfect.
just a
Thank
general
you.
description. And this hatchery up at the head of Rivers Inlet in the territory of the Wiikino people is a wonderful partnership with some of the what do we call them? Sport fish lodges, recreational lodges in the area, Duncanby and Good Hope, and the Wiikino Nation, supported by DFO, and PSF is the kind of partner helping to pull these entities or support these entities in pulling their energies and interests together and working to have people there to help operate, support, assess the operations of this hatchery. So it's a different model. It's a model where it's not solely dependent on government funding. It's substantially, almost entirely run by funding that's raised by these sport fish entities and then operated in very direct partnership with the First Nation.
Right.
So it's a really neat idea, and it's something that we've been talking with the people that, I don't think we're trying to take credit for the idea.
No.
We are happy to be an entity that support, but the idea really came from the people that were out there.
Rick Hansen,
Yeah, Rick
Sid
Hansen.
Kay, Tony Allard.
Yeah, and they have an idea that maybe this could be exported to other places, and that's something that we've been talking to them about. Again, it's not our idea, but it's something that, with the time we have with you today, we thought we would mention it.
And it sounds like this touches on what you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, Michael, which is the coordination issue.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a good example of where there's been coordination amongst various stakeholders, and it sounds like you got a successful program.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the interesting things about this one, Andrew, someone likes to fish. This is scientifically been proven. This Rivers Inlet and these Chinook that come from there are scientifically proven to be critically important genetically in terms of the really big Chinook that sport anglers love, and the First Nations need. But there's, just Google, the Rivers Inlet Wannock Chinook program, and you'll see these humongous 70, 80 pound Chinook coming back to spawn.
Yeah.
And most importantly, from the First Nations perspective, they had a hatchery. It had gone defunct. They needed some money, but they had the will and the commitment because from a conservation standpoint, they wanted to make sure that those fish maintained for the future. And it is a wonderful story of many different people of different backgrounds coming together and working together and making so far it's been a great success with the help of Rick Hansen and Sid Key, Tony Allard, and many others, Teddy Walkus. They built a $2 million plus facility, brand new hatchery operation a few years ago. That's going very well.
Well, that's a great story.
And the chief and council of the nation, a big supporter.
We couldn't do it it's their land. It's their will that it exists. And there are many activities that go on in that hatchery where the First Nations members come in and participate, tagging and whatnot that goes on for the research programs.
Yeah.
So you got to start it.
Yeah, that's a good story. Well, let's contrast. That's a phenomenal story. Thank you for that. Let's contrast that to a small sort of community group that's making some big headways in their small little area of the world to the Fraser Sockeye. Now, the Fraser River is a massive river, huge amount of development. So to give the listeners who are, to give some context, in 2004, the amount of Fraser Sockeye salmon that returned to spawn was 4 million. In 2008, it was roughly about 1.6 million. In 2000, so these are in 4-year increments. In 2012, it was 2.25 million. And then in 2016, it dropped to 750,000. And in last year, it was about 250,000. An absolute fraction of what we saw a short 16 years ago. Mm. I mean, this is really not a very good picture.
It's frightening. And just for context, the reason that these are shown in 4-year increments is sockeye in the Fraser come back very, very strongly on a 4-year cycle.
Okay.
So other salmon species might have some variability, like Chinook can come back as 3, 4, 5, even 6 years old. Sockeye are in the high 90% likely to come back as 4-year-olds. So this is not showing a variability where you have a strong year and a weak year, and that's kind of part of the natural cycle. This is showing that on this run cycle in the Fraser River, back in 2004, there were 4 million fish in a healthy fishery. For everybody, a healthy commercial fishery. There was a sport fishery. There was a healthy First Nation fishery. All able to
4 million.
all able to benefit
4
from
million,
this
just
wonderful
let
return.
that sink in. 4 million in 2004 and 250,000 in 2020.
Well, and since we're going to spend a few minutes on doom and gloom, to just pile on top of this, a lot of these fish had to get past the rock slide at Big Bar.
So sorry, what is that?
There's a big landslide on the Fraser River at Big Bar,
Okay.
which is north of Lillooet, between
Okay.
Lillooet and Williams Lake.
Okay.
So it was quite it was getting a lot of traffic in the news when it was first discovered in 2019. But it essentially blocks fish ability to get past that point in the river at the flows that they have during the time of year they're trying to migrate. So you have a situation where more than likely the ocean conditions have been so poor for these fish that they have dropped, probably compounded by other factors, maybe fishing and other environmental concerns. But then when they get into the river, a number of those populations, as they spread out through the Fraser, would have had to get past this new impediment, which is actually a natural event, this big landslide into the Fraser River that is almost nearly stopping them from getting up to their spawning grounds.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, the Big Bar cannot be underestimated. It is a huge problem.
Right.
And the government has spent 200 plus million at this point.
They've at least committed that. I don't know how much of it has been spent. But
this
in the
just happened
neighborhood
2
of that.
years ago. 2 years ago in July, right?
Yeah. Well, it was discovered in about, I don't know, May or June in 2019.
Yeah. So, it's a relatively new thing. But there's no way to get around it. It's a that way or no.
Right.
So it is being addressed, and the government has made they've made a natural fishway for the fish to try to get up when the water levels are allowing it. They're constructing a man-made solution. They had
Like a fish ladder.
A fish ladder. They had a fish cannon that was brought up from the United States. Actually, move the fish up, shoot them in a cannon up over. Yeah, because of this very problem.
Well, whatever
that we're
works.
talking about.
I guess.
Well, a cannon. We have to be careful. A cannon's a bit
It's
of
not
a
a
misnomer.
cannon.
It's actually a
shoots them
relatively
into the water.
gentle water tube.
Gives good
that
imagery.
pushes
You know what?
them
You
up there.
should
But
invite some of
a
those
fish
fish to
cannon
come be
seems-
interviewed. How was it to take the cannon? But the point I'd make about this one with the sockeye and Big Bar is, a lot of issues, human issues, social issues in particular, like homelessness, or we're going to fix this problem by X date, right? So you can't do that with the environment. You can't do that. Turns out you can't do it with homelessness either, apparently. You can't definitely do it with salmon because the conditions are constantly changing and evolving.
Right.
And this is the message we have to get to politicians who are very well-intended. You cannot expect to drop a bunch of money one year and in a year or two it's going to be fixed. This is going to require, first of all, we've gotten ourselves into a big hole, right? We've allowed this to get to this point, and it's going to take a long time to get out of it. It's going to take a lot of money. And I think the other point I'd make is there's no silver bullets, right? We will fix Big Bar eventually, and good on the federal and provincial government for doing that. But something else will happen.
Right.
And so we have to always be, this is why better data collection, better data assessment, always investing in science, including citizen science, First Nations, this is critical, and keeping that up, right? Down in Washington State, just quick example, just to fix the habitat concerns alone that they have around what it would take to recover salmon, they estimate $4 billion.
Wow.
$4 billion.
$4 billion.
And they made that estimate, incidentally, many years ago. And they've only made a little bit of a dent in that. So, order of magnitude, this is a big thing to maintain these animals if we are going to continue to develop and access them the way we would like to. Right? We have to just decide, are we going to make that commitment as a society or not? We think we should, and hope that we will.
And just to emphasize a point I made a bit earlier, that's assuming we don't keep digging the hole deeper, right? So somebody asked me.
This is about the behavioral change that we all have.
That's
the
right.
mindset you were talking about, Jason.
Somebody asked me a long time ago, what do we need so that salmon are as good 50 years from now as they are today? And I said, we just have to stop wrecking stuff, right? But we can't do that. Our society expects to develop and grow and our economy prosper, and that's okay. But if we have to do it carefully and thoughtfully and recognize that, if we're going to want to have a mall with a Costco in our neighborhood, maybe you don't build it on the wetland that's salmon winter habitat. And somebody that maybe stands to profit from that will make a compelling case as to why it's a good business investment. But you then have to ask yourself, what would it cost to replace that salmon habitat? And maybe the better choice is to protect the salmon habitat that nature's already put there for you and move that development somewhere else or do that development a different way. It's not about let's stop and all go, try to live under a tree or that kind of thing, because that's, where the rhetoric can get to. It's about using the science that we have and the know-how that we have to allow our economy to develop, but to develop in a way that sustains the salmon alongside us.